I raised my kids alone, and on the day I retired, I made a barbecue just for them. They texted back, "We're going out with the guys from work." I didn't argue. I just sold the backyard and vanished. Subscribe to our channel and watch until the end, because this story doesn't end the way you imagine. My name is Robert, and maybe you felt this too, that quiet kind of love that doesn't ask for anything back. I wasn't a perfect father, but I was present, always present. Every fever, every school play, every parent-teacher meeting where I sat alone among couples. I cooked, I cleaned, I folded tiny socks, and signed every permission slip. I was the one who made sure there was toothpaste in the bathroom and warm soup when someone sneezed. I filled every role without asking for applause, because when you love someone, really love them, showing up becomes your default setting. Their mother left when they were still small. One day, she just said she needed to find herself and walked out with a suitcase, leaving behind 2 confused children and a man who hadn't even figured out how to do a proper ponytail yet. I didn't chase her. I couldn't. Not with 2 little ones holding onto my legs, asking what was for dinner. I cried that night, quietly, in the bathroom with the water running. But the next morning, I made pancakes and packed their lunches like nothing had changed. Because for them, it couldn't. I learned fast. Learned how to separate darks from lights in the laundry. Learned that my son liked his sandwiches cut diagonally, and my daughter couldn't sleep without the hallway light on. I read parenting books late at night and practiced braiding hair on a doll I borrowed from the neighbor's kid. I gave everything I had to them, and when that ran out, I gave what I didn't have too. Years passed. They grew taller, busier, and more distant. Conversations became check-ins. Messages turned into silence. I told myself that's how life worked. That children grow up and move on. That maybe, just maybe, they'd look back one day and realize I was the only one who never left. But deep down, there's a kind of ache that comes from being forgotten in slow motion. And that ache became my shadow. Still, I never stopped trying. Every Sunday, I made enough food for 3, sometimes for if I thought they might bring someone over. I marinated the meat, made their favorite side dishes, and set the table like it meant something. The chair stayed empty, but I kept doing it. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of hope, or maybe because it hurt less than admitting they had stopped coming on purpose. When I finally retired, I saw it as a chance. A new chapter, a moment to gather the people I loved and mark the end of a long journey. I didn't want a party or presents, just a simple barbecue. The same backyard where I taught them how to ride bikes and chase them with a hose on hot summer days. I cleaned the patio, scrubbed the old grill, even bought the expensive cuts of meat I usually avoided. I set out the chairs in the exact spots they used to sit as kids, close to me, but always bickering over who got the last sausage. I was nervous that morning, the kind of nervous that makes you wipe down things that are already clean. I kept checking the time, checking my phone. The grill was hot. The table was set. The soda was cold. And then nothing. Just 2 messages. One from each. Different wording. Same meaning. "Sorry, Dad. Can't make it. Something came up. Work stuff. No offer to reschedule. No real excuse. Just absence, wrapped in casual dismissal." I stood there, staring at the screen like it might blink and show something different. Like maybe they'd realize what today was, what it meant. But the screen stayed still. So I turned it over, placed it face down on the table, and sat in one of the chairs I'd arranged just for them. The meat went untouched. The coals burned down slowly. The silence settled in like dust on furniture no one uses anymore. And in that moment, something inside me finally shifted. Not in anger, not in sadness, but in clarity. The kind that comes not from a single heartbreak, but from 1,000 tiny ones you've been ignoring for years. I didn't yell, didn't send a bitter reply, or post something vague online hoping they'd feel guilty. I just sat there, watching the smoke curl into the air, and realized I had finally been given permission, not by them, but by life, to stop waiting, to stop holding space for people who didn't care to fill it. I cleared the table, put the chairs away, turned off the lights in the backyard, and I made a decision. Quiet, simple, and irreversible. I was done being convenient. I was done being invisible. And whatever came next, it would be on my terms. The next morning, the grill was still there, cold, blackened, as if the smoke from the night before had taken something with it when it left. I stood by the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the empty chairs I'd arranged so carefully. One of them had fallen over during the night. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was just gravity reminding me what neglect looks like when it's not poetic. I didn't touch anything that day. I left the plates on the table, the soda still half frozen in the cooler, the folded napkins untouched. It was as if I needed the scene to stay frozen for a little longer, like proof that I hadn't imagined the effort. I needed to see it, to feel the weight of it. Because when you give everything you have to people and they still don't show up, something in you starts to question if any of it was ever real. Or worse, if you were ever really seen at all. That evening, I sat alone on the back steps and opened a beer I'd bought especially for my son. He used to joke that I drank the old man brands, and I'd picked up his favorite thinking it would make him smile. I don't even like the taste of that stuff. But I drank it anyway, just to see what it felt like to swallow disappointment down with something that burned. It didn't help, but it was something to do. I thought about calling them. Not to yell, not to guilt trip, just to ask why. To hear something, anything, that might explain how two people I raised with every fiber of my being could forget me so easily. But the truth is, I already knew the answer. Life gets loud. People move on. And love, when it's always available, becomes background noise. I spent the next few days pretending everything was fine. I put the chairs back in the shed, cleaned the grill, tossed the meat. I even told the neighbors the barbecue went just fine, because it's easier to lie than to admit you sat alone in your backyard on the day that was supposed to mean something. I answered texts with emojis, laughed at the right memes, kept the illusion alive, because nobody really wants to know when you're hurting. They want you to be okay, quietly. But in the quiet, I started asking myself questions I hadn't dared before. Not about them, about me. About why I was still here, in this house filled with memories that no one else wanted. Why I was still mowing the lawn every Saturday, trimming the same hedges I once shaped into cartoon characters to make my kids laugh. Why I still left the porch light on, even when no one ever came home late. The house was too big for one man, too full of echoes that didn't belong to the present. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me of tiny feet running down the hallway. Every dent in the wall held a story. And suddenly, all of it felt heavy, like I wasn't living there anymore, just haunting it. That's when I made the second decision. The first was letting go of the waiting. The second was letting go of the place itself. I didn't tell anyone, not friends, not neighbors, not even the kids. I met with a realtor, signed the papers, and started packing little by little. Not the big things, just the things that mattered to me. A photo from when I still had dark hair. A watch my father gave me before he passed. A handwritten note from my daughter when she was 6 that said, "You're the bestest daddy ever." I didn't need much. I wasn't running away. I was just done living in a museum of absence. I sold the backyard first. The piece of land behind the house that had once held inflatable pools, trampolines, folding chairs, and laughter. A young couple with a toddler bought it, so they were going to build a little home office back there. I nodded and smiled, watching as they measured things and made plans, not knowing that every inch they stepped on held 10,000 memories I was finally ready to let go of. The money helped, not because I needed it, but because it gave me options. Freedom. Choices. I used it to quietly settle a few things. Cleared debts I never talked about. Donated to a few places I believed in. Bought myself a new pair of shoes. Nothing fancy, just something that fit better than the ones I'd worn for years out of habit. It felt strange, spending money on me. I'd forgotten what that was like. Packing the last few boxes was easier than I thought it would be. By then, I'd already let go emotionally. The house wasn't mine anymore. It was just a shell of the life I once built. A beautiful, flawed, exhausting life. I left a note on the kitchen table. Nothing poetic, just a line from an old song I used to play while cleaning on Sundays. I gave you everything I had. And then I left. Locked the door, dropped the keys in an envelope, and walked away. No one knew where I went. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like peace. I woke up early on my last morning in the house, long before the sun pushed its light through the blinds. The floor creaked beneath my feet in the same way it always had, a sound I once associated with small footsteps racing to the kitchen, asking for cereal or cartoons. But there were no footsteps now, only mine. Slower, quieter, intentional. The kitchen smelled like coffee grounds and old wood. I made it the same way I always did. 3 scoops, slow drip, splash of milk, no sugar. I leaned against the counter while it brewed, not rushing. There was no one to rush for anymore. And somehow, that made the moment heavier. I poured the coffee into my favorite mug, the one with a chipped handle and faded letters that read, "World's okayest dad." A joke gift from my daughter when she was a teenager. I'd laughed when I opened it, but secretly, it meant more to me than any award I ever got at work. I stepped outside with the mug in hand. The backyard was still, the kind of stillness that holds memory, not silence. The grass was damp, the sky streaked with early gold. I sat on the edge of the old wooden step and let the warmth of the cup press into my palms. I took a sip, and I stayed there, not thinking about what I'd packed or what I might be forgetting, just letting the moment exist. The yard had held so much life. I could still see it if I closed my eyes. My son, chasing bubbles with bare feet and grass stains on his knees. My daughter, turning the garden hose into a game and laughing until she hiccuped. Birthday balloons tied to lawn chairs. Makeshift tents made out of bed sheets. Late-night talks under strings of cheap fairy lights. And later, years later, quiet barbecues with fewer people, fewer words, but the same quiet hope that maybe they'd stay just a little longer this time. I thought about the last time I saw them both together in that yard. I don't even remember the occasion. Maybe a holiday. Maybe one of them was just in town and the other tagged along. What I do remember is how quickly they had to leave. Phones buzzing. Work things. Plans they couldn't change. I smiled and nodded, as always, pretending it didn't sting. But always did. Not because they left, but because I never seemed to be reason enough for them to stay. I took another sip of coffee and looked toward the spot where the grill used to be. It was gone now, sold, just like the land behind it. There was a patch of earth where it had stood, slightly darker than the rest, like the ground hadn't figured out how to forget it yet. I knew the feeling. There's something strange about watching your life get dismantled piece by piece. First the tool shed, then the garden bench, then the wind chimes by the fence. I told myself it was just stuff, just objects, but each one held a version of me, versions I wasn't sure would ever come back. And maybe that's the point. Maybe letting go isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about honoring what was and deciding what no longer belongs in the story you're writing next. The neighbor's dog barked twice, then quieted. A car passed in the distance. Somewhere, a lawn sprinkler clicked on. Life moved like it always did, and I realized how long it had been since mine had moved with it. I'd been stuck in place, orbiting memories like they were still alive, keeping traditions for people who stopped noticing them years ago. I looked down at my mug. The coffee was almost gone. Lukewarm. A thin ring around the rim. I thought about refilling it, then changed my mind. This cup was enough. More than enough. It was the last one, and I wanted to stay that way. Inside, the boxes were stacked by the door, labeled and taped, waiting to be lifted and carried into a new life. I hadn't told my kids, not because I was hiding, but because I no longer felt the need to explain myself. I used to share everything with them, little updates, photos of the garden, texts about the weather. Most of it went unanswered. Over time, I stopped sending, and when I realized they hadn't noticed, something in me let go. I stood up and gave the backyard one last look. Not dramatic, just a quiet scan, like you do when you're leaving a hotel room, making sure you didn't forget your charger. I whispered a small thank you to the space, the air, the memories, not for being perfect, but for being mine, for giving me years of noise, and then teaching me how to find peace in the silence that followed. As I stepped back inside and placed the mug in the sink, I felt lighter, not because I had less, but because I no longer carried the weight of being forgotten. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was just done waiting. And that morning, with the house still full of boxes and the sun slowly rising behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. I didn't leave with a grand announcement. No teary goodbyes. No dramatic posts online. No letters taped to the door. Just one morning, after the last box was taped shut, I picked up the keys and slid them into my jacket pocket like I'd done 100 times before. Only this time, I knew I'd never use them again. The moving van arrived on time. The two men barely made eye contact with me, just nodded politely, asked which boxes went first, and started loading. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them carry out the last pieces of a life I'd spent decades building. The couch where my daughter fell asleep watching cartoons. The table where my son did his homework, and where, later, I ate dinner alone. The hallway mirror that used to catch glimpses of us running late, but laughing anyway. It all moved like it had no weight, but I felt every step of it. I thought it would hurt more. I thought I want to cling to something, some picture frame, some drawer that smelled like memories. But the truth is, when you've been grieving people who are still alive for long enough, leaving becomes easy. It's not running away. It's just stopping the waiting. I left the house as clean as I could, vacuumed the floors, wiped down the counters, even replaced a light bulb that had gone out in the hallway. I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted the next person who walked through that door to feel welcomed. Maybe because I wanted to leave with dignity. Or maybe I just needed to feel like I had control over something in a world where I'd spent years being the afterthought. The final thing I did was place the keys inside a plain white envelope, wrote, "Thank you for the memories," on the front, and left it on the kitchen counter. It wasn't meant for anyone. Just a line. A nod to everything that once was, and everything I was choosing to leave behind. As I stepped outside, I took one last look at the house, not through the eyes of a father or a homeowner, but as a man who had finally learned the difference between holding on and being held hostage. The door closed softly behind me. No wind, no slam, just quiet, like it understood. I didn't have a destination set in stone, just a new apartment I rented across town. Small, simple, just enough. It didn't need a backyard or a guest room. I wasn't hosting birthdays or waiting for surprise visits anymore. All I needed was space to breathe, a place where silence didn't echo like abandonment, but settled in like peace. The apartment building was older, with red bricks and creaky stairs. The kind of place where people nodded politely but didn't ask questions. I liked that. I didn't want to explain myself. I didn't want to tell anyone what I used to be. In that new space, I wasn't Dad or Mr. Costa or the guy with the grill. I was just a man with a second chance at solitude, and I intended to treat it like something sacred. Unpacking was slower than packing. I didn't feel urgency anymore. I hung the framed photo of my kids when they were little, not because I was holding on, but because I wanted to remember that once we had been close. Once I was their whole world. That deserved to be honored, even if it no longer defined me. The days took on a new rhythm. Mornings with quiet coffee. Afternoons filled with books I'd never had time to read. Walks around the block just to feel the sun on my face. I signed up for a community class at the library. Nothing serious, just watercolor painting. It felt awkward at first, sitting at a table surrounded by strangers with wrinkled hands and kind eyes. But it also felt good, like maybe there was still life waiting to be lived, just outside the fences I had built out of routine and obligation. I didn't tell my children I had moved. I didn't send a new address. There were no breadcrumbs to follow, no trail to lead them to me. Not out of spite, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to know who I was when I wasn't performing for their love anymore. I needed to see who would show up when there was nothing left to take for granted. Some nights, I still thought of them, wondered if they ever glanced at their phones and considered calling, wondered if they'd drive past the old house and notice the lights were different, the flowers in the front yard replaced. But I didn't let those thoughts linger. They were clouds, passing, shifting, never staying long enough to rain. What stayed was something else. A stillness I hadn't felt in years. A calm that settled in my bones. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally stopped pretending it didn't hurt. Leaving wasn't about punishing them. It was about choosing me. For once. And maybe they'd never understand that. Maybe they'd think I disappeared. But the truth is, I simply arrived. The first morning in the new apartment felt unfamiliar in the best way. No creaky floorboards. No familiar hum of the old fridge. No framed family portrait staring back at me from every wall. Just quiet. Real quiet. Not the kind that echoes with what's missing, but the kind that makes you realize how much space you actually have to fill when you're no longer waiting for someone else to show up. I didn't set an alarm. I didn't need to. I woke up naturally, the way your body does when it's not bracing for something. The sunlight filtered in through the window, soft and patient. I got up, made coffee, and stood barefoot in my little kitchen, feeling the cool tile under my feet. Everything felt slower, but not in a sad way, in a deliberate way. Like I was finally moving at the pace of my own life, not someone else's demands. I started building new routines. Nothing dramatic. I'd walk to the corner bakery every Tuesday and chat with the older man who ran it, who always added an extra roll to my bag without saying a word. On Thursdays, I went to the library for that painting class, and even though I was terrible with a brush, it made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. I'd forgotten how satisfying it was to try something and not be good at it, but still keep going. Most days I walked around the neighborhood, by the park, through the little side streets where kids drew chalk hopscotch patterns on the sidewalk. I didn't wear headphones. I like hearing the world again, the rustling of trees, distant dogs barking, the way my shoes scuffed slightly against the concrete when I dragged my feet a little too long. It all made me feel present. And after years of showing up for everyone else, it felt good to finally show up for myself. I bought a plant, a small one, something green with thick leaves that didn't need much care. I named it Sal. Don't ask me why. It just looked like a Sal. I placed him near the window, and every morning, I turned him slightly so he could catch the sun. It became a ritual, a quiet promise that I was still growing too, even if no one else noticed. I didn't miss the old house the way I thought I would. What I missed, sometimes, were the illusions I'd built inside it. The idea that family would always mean closeness, that raising kids alone would earn me some unspoken, everlasting loyalty. That love, if given completely, would eventually return. But the thing about illusions is they only survive as long as you keep feeding them. Once I stopped, they faded, and in their place, something sturdier began to form: truth. I wasn't bitter. That surprised me. I thought maybe I would be. I had every right to be. But bitterness is heavy, and I'd carried enough weight. What I felt instead was something quieter, a kind of grief, maybe, but not for what I lost, for what never really existed in the way I thought it did. The family I pictured, the connection I believed was mutual. Letting go of that fantasy hurt, yes, but it also freed me. Every now and then, I'd pass by a father with his kid, or hear a grown son on the phone with his dad in the grocery store, and something in me would flinch, a reflex I couldn't unlearn. I'd wonder what it would have been like if my kids had turned out different, if they had seen me, not just used me, if they had ever asked themselves what it cost me to carry everything for so long. But then I'd remind myself, I'm not here to rewrite them. I'm here to rewrite me. One afternoon, I sat in a cafe near the river, sketching something I knew would never become a painting. It was messy, uneven, but it was mine. A woman a few tables over smiled and said, "I like your lines. They feel honest." I thanked her and tucked the compliment into my pocket like it was something fragile. Because it was. When you spend a lifetime being useful, it's disorienting to be seen as interesting. I didn't tell her my story. Didn't tell her about the barbecue, or the house, or the years spent chasing ghosts of obligation. I just let the moment be what it was. A kind gesture from a stranger, offered with no strings attached. And that, somehow, meant more than all the empty, "I'll call you laters" I'd collected over the years. Back at home, I stood by the window, Sal sitting quietly by my side. The sun had shifted. It was time to turn him again. I did it carefully, gently, like it mattered. Because it did. Because I mattered. I looked around the apartment. Still sparse. Still unfamiliar in some ways. But it didn't feel temporary anymore. It felt claimed. Not by a family. Not by history. But by me. And that's when it hit me, not as a revelation, but as a quiet truth I had grown into over time. I am not what was left behind. I am who chose to leave. And there's a power in that, a quiet, steady power. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Warm breeze, soft clouds, the kind of day I used to save for family lunches and folding lawn chairs in the yard. I was sitting in my new place, flipping through a magazine I had no intention of reading, when my phone lit up with an unknown number. I stared at it for a few seconds before letting it go dark again. No voicemail, no text, just a silent signal that, somewhere, someone remembered I existed. I didn't call back. Instead, I went for a walk, past the bakery, waved at the couple who always argued while watering their plants, stopped by the park, and sat on a bench under the big tree, whose branches seemed to hold more peace than most people ever do. I watched a group of kids kicking a ball and laughed quietly when it rolled toward me. I kicked it back, and for a second, I felt like I belonged to the world again. When I got home, there was a message waiting. "Hey, Dad, can we talk?" No name, no punctuation, but I knew who it was. The tone, the hesitation, it was unmistakable. I stared at it for a while, then locked the screen and set the phone down. Not out of anger, not out of pride, I just needed time to figure out whether this was a door I was ready to open or one I'd already walked too far beyond. Later that week, a neighbor from my old street called. Not a close friend, just someone who used to borrow my ladder now and then. He said 2 people had shown up at my old house, asking for me. Grown kids. One tall, one quiet. Said they looked confused when the new tenant answered the door. Didn't even know you moved, he told me, like it was some kind of surprise. But I wasn't surprised. Not even a little. Because they hadn't noticed I was gone. They had noticed the house was. I imagined the scene. My son, knocking confidently, expecting the same old porch, same old dad waiting with some hopeful smile and leftover patience. The door opening to a stranger. Confusion. Maybe even frustration. Where's Robert? He used to live here. Do you have his address? Nope, sorry. And just like that, the map ended. Part of me wondered what they said next. If they blamed each other. If they shrugged and drove off. If, even for a moment, they realized what it meant to show up late to a place where time had already moved on. I'd spent so long imagining reconciliation as this dramatic scene. Tears, hugs, long apologies. But the truth is, most reckoning comes quiet. Sometimes, it knocks on a door you no longer live behind. I didn't reply to the message. I didn't block them either. I just let it sit there, like a book I wasn't ready to finish. I went about my day, washed dishes, watered Sal, listened to some old records I hadn't played in years. I danced alone in the kitchen while pasta boiled on the stove, and for the first time in ages, I didn't feel like I owed anyone anything for that joy. There's a strange peace that comes with being unfindable. Not in a hiding kind of way, but in a liberated kind of way. For years, I made myself easy to reach. Always available. Always waiting. Phone on. Heart open. But all that ever got me was silence. And now that I'd stepped out of the spotlight, now they were looking. I thought about what I'd say if they ever did find me. If they showed up at my door with sad eyes and recycled apologies. I'd like to believe I'd be kind. That I'd invite them in, offer coffee, ask how life's been. But I also know better. I know that words don't fix absence. That time is a currency, and they spent all of mine like it had no value. So no, I wouldn't slam the door, but I wouldn't reopen it all the way either. That evening, I went for another walk. The sky was painted in warm colors, and the air smelled like something between fresh bread and distant rain. I passed a bookstore and bought a novel I'd never heard of, just because I liked the cover. Back home, I lit a candle, sat by the window, and read the first chapter out loud to no one, just because it felt good to hear my own voice filling the room. The message stayed unread. The house they once called home was now someone else's. And the man they used to know, the one who waited by the grill, who smiled through being forgotten, who left the porch light on just in case, he wasn't gone. He had simply outgrown the frame they kept him in. I used to rehearse it in my head. That conversation, the one where they'd sit across from me, eyes softer than I remembered, maybe even a little ashamed. They'd start with something like, "We didn't realize," or "We were just busy," and I'd listen patiently, nodding like I hadn't waited years to hear those words. I imagined myself saying something wise and measured, something that would make them understand without making them feel too small. But that conversation never came. And over time, I stopped rehearsing it. Instead, I started speaking to myself more. Not out loud, not crazy talk, just the quiet kind of thinking that fills the space when you no longer expect anyone to ask how your day was. I'd wash dishes and remember the way my daughter used to hum when she helped dry them. I'd walk past the coffee shop where my son once spilled hot chocolate on my lap and laughed so hard he couldn't breathe. These weren't memories I resented, just moments I visited like old houses I no longer had the key to. The message stayed there, unread, untouched. One line, sitting in the inbox like a leaf pressed in a book, waiting, unchanged, slowly forgotten. Every now and then, I'd hover over it, thumb pausing just long enough to feel something shift but not enough to act. Because by then, I understood something they hadn't. Some apologies don't need to be refused. They just don't need to be accepted anymore. I think people assume that when a parent pulls away, it must be dramatic, that it's done with slamming doors and angry voicemails. But the truth is, it's much quieter than that. It's the silence you choose after years of shouting into a void. It's the decision to stop knocking on a door you built with your own hands, because the ones inside never bothered to open it. I started journaling. Nothing poetic, Just scribbles about my day, random thoughts, feelings that didn't need a witness. It became a habit, a kind of proof that I was still here, still thinking, still feeling, even if no one asked. One day I wrote, "They'll try to come back when it's no longer about love, but about guilt, and I won't know what to do with either." I closed the notebook and didn't look at that page again. A friend from the painting class, her name was Eliza, once asked if I had kids. I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I didn't know what version to give her. The technical one, the emotional one, the one where I smile and say, "Yeah, 2 grown kids," or the one where I say, "I raised them, alone, and now I live alone." In the end, I just said, "Yeah, 2. She smiled and said, "They're lucky," and I didn't have the heart to correct her. Let her believe the version that still had warmth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying old birthdays, old jokes, old silences. There was this moment I kept coming back to. My son was maybe 10, my daughter 12. We were stuck inside during a storm. The power had gone out, so we lit candles and told stories, made up games in the living room. We laughed for hours. It was nothing, really. But I remember thinking, this is enough. And maybe that was the problem. I thought moments like that built something permanent. I thought love, real love, had memory. I thought if you showed up enough times, eventually, someone would remember to show up for you too. I wish I could tell you there was a grand confrontation, that they found me, sat me down, poured their hearts out, and that I said something powerful in return. But real life isn't a movie. Sometimes the confrontation never comes. Sometimes the truth just lives quietly in the space between what should have happened and what actually did. They didn't call again. Not after the message. Not after showing up at the old house. And I didn't reach out either. Not because I was angry, but because I had already said everything I needed to, just not with words. With distance. With absence. With peace. That was my conversation. And it was enough. It's strange how quickly people stop looking for you when they realize you've stopped waiting for them. For a while, I expected them to try again. Another message. A call. Maybe a birthday text sent too late, but still trying to mean something. But nothing came. Just silence. The same kind I used to live in, only now it didn't hurt the way it used to. Now it felt like a blanket I'd finally learned to wrap around myself. I started noticing how quiet things could still feel full. My days had shape. Mornings with coffee and music. Afternoons where I wandered without needing a destination. I had a few friends now. Not close ones, not the kind you call at midnight, but people who waved when they saw me. People who remembered how I liked my coffee, who saved me a seat at the library events. That was enough. I didn't need to be seen by everyone. I just needed not to be invisible to myself anymore. Some Sundays, I still thought about them. Out of habit, mostly. I'd walk by a park and see a father teaching his kid to ride a bike and feel a kind of echo in my chest. Not sadness, not envy, just recognition. A shadow of who I used to be. There was a time when I believed those moments would be enough to tie us together forever. That the effort alone would secure the relationship. But effort without reciprocity is just erosion. I gave everything I had until there was nothing left but shape and silence. They never came to visit. Not once. Not after the message. Not after learning I no longer lived where they'd left me. I suppose they expected I'd circle back eventually. That I'd miss them more than I valued my own peace. But they were wrong. What I missed wasn't them. It was the version of them I carried in my memory. The children who once reached for my hand in crowded parking lots. Who ran toward me at school pickups. Who cried into my chest like it was home. But those versions were long gone. And I had finally stopped mistaking memory for presence. I got a letter one day. Not from them. From the utility company that used to send bills to the old house. It was forwarded to my new address. Just a piece of paper. Just a number. But when I saw the address printed at the top, my chest tightened for a moment. That street. That house. That life. I threw it away without opening it. Not because it meant nothing, but because I didn't need to be reminded of what I'd already let go. Around that same time, someone in my building passed away. An older man. Quiet. Lived on the 3rd floor. I didn't know him well, just enough to nod in the hallway. When they cleared out his apartment, I noticed how little he left behind. 2 boxes, maybe 3. A chair. A few books. It made me think about what I'd leave if I vanished today. What would speak for me when I no longer could? Not the furniture, not the clothes, but maybe the plants I cared for. The notes I kept in a drawer. The painting with uneven brushstrokes I never quite finished. And I wondered if that was enough. If it had to be, there's a dignity in disappearing on your own terms. Not out of bitterness, not as punishment, but as preservation. I used to think love meant holding space no matter how long someone stayed away. But now I know better. Love, real love, has limits. And those limits protect the parts of you that once believed too easily. I don't hate them. That would still be giving them space. What I've done is simpler, quieter. I've closed the door, locked it, and walked away with the key in my own pocket. Eliza from painting class asked again if I had family nearby. I gave her the same answer I always do. A soft nod, a gentle smile. Let her fill in the blanks however she needs to. There's no malice in it, just choice. I've learned that not every truth needs to be spoken to be real. Some truths are live in the way you carry yourself, in a peace that lingers even when no one's watching. That weekend, I went to a flea market and bought a small radio. It only plays one station clearly, but it's enough. At night, I let it hum in the background while I cook. Old songs, fuzzy voices, static between stations. It makes the apartment feel lived in. It makes me feel rooted. I dance sometimes, even when no one's looking. Especially when no one's looking. There's a freedom in not waiting anymore, in not hoping they'll walk through the door, in realizing that if someone doesn't come back, maybe the story was never about them returning, but about you learning how to stay with yourself. And that's what I did. I stayed. Not for them. For me. There's a kind of silence that doesn't ache anymore. I used to think quiet was something you had to fill. Music, television, voices, even noise for the sake of noise. Anything to prove you weren't alone. But now, most mornings, I sit by the window with my coffee. No sound but the hum of the street outside and the rustle of leaves against the glass. And I realize this kind of silence feels like belonging. Like the world finally exhaled, and I get to breathe with it. I've made this place mine. Not in the way people hang up family portraits or paint accent walls. It's smaller than that. A mug that fits just right in my hand. A reading lamp with soft light. A record player that sometimes skips, but always at the right moment. A half-finished puzzle on the table. I found comfort in the ordinary. Because when the extraordinary forgets you, you learn to build peace out of what stays. Some days I still imagine them knocking again. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of love. It doesn't really matter. The door would open, and they'd stand there with that look people wear when they're trying to stitch time back together with nothing but threadbare words. And maybe once, I would have stepped aside, invited them in, let them back into a space they hadn't earned. But now, I don't think I'd even reach for the handle. Not because I'm cold, but because I've worked too hard for this piece to trade it for apologies that only show up after the damage is done. You see, forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's just choosing to walk past the wound without pressing on it again. And I've done that. Quietly. Every day. I've let go without applause. Without confirmation. Just me and the silence. Learning to coexist. The friends I've made here, they don't know the full story. They don't need to. They know me as the man who always has a book under his arm. Who shows up early to events and brings extra snacks just in case. They know I laugh at old jokes and that I cry during certain songs. They know I never talk about my kids, and they never ask why. That, in itself, is a kind of love, being seen without being interrogated. One evening, I hosted a small dinner. Nothing fancy, just a few people from the library group, Eliza from painting class, the baker and his wife. We sat around my little table, passing dishes, trading stories, laughing in the kind of way that feels like medicine. At one point, someone asked, "How long have you lived here?" And without thinking, I said, "Long enough to call a home." And I meant it. That night, after everyone left and the dishes were drying in the rack, I stood at the doorway of my apartment. Not inside, not outside, just standing there, holding the frame, realizing that for the first time in years, I didn't feel the pull of another place. I didn't feel like I was missing something. I didn't feel like I was waiting for anyone to come back. There's power in that. A quiet kind of power. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but anchors you just the same. I used to define my worth by how needed I was, by who relied on me, but now I measure it differently. In the softness of my own voice when I speak to myself kindly. In the way my shoulders fall when I'm not bracing for disappointment. In the stillness that no longer feels like absence, but arrival. They may never know where I went. They may never understand why I stopped answering. And maybe that's okay. Not every story needs a clean ending. Not every bond is meant to survive the weight of growing apart. Some connections fade quietly, not out of hate, but because one person simply decided to stop bleeding for the sake of being remembered. And if, one day, they do find this place, if by chance or guilt or desperation, they stand outside my door again, I don't know what I'll say. Maybe I won't say anything. Maybe I'll just smile the way you do when you see a ghost. Familiar, but untouchable. A memory, not a presence. A chapter already written. But for now, the door stays closed. Not locked, just closed. Because inside, there's warmth. There's peace. There's me. And for the first time in a long, long time, that's enough.